Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this second Zero to Infinity Hangout. This one is about NewSpace. So NewSpace is a novel concept, or not really actually. It started way back in the 80s, but the definition is a little bit tricky. I found on Wikipedia the magical tool that is defined usually as covering approaches to space development that differ significantly from that taken by NASA and the mainstream aerospace industry. So it's a bit like an umbrella term for a movement often affiliated with an emergent private spaceflight industry. Specifically, the term is used to refer to a community of relatively new aerospace companies working to develop low-cost access to space or spaceflight technologies and advocate for these low-cost technologies. So it typically includes several criteria, like development of launch systems, primarily with private funding, low-cost approaches or budgeting plans, drive towards innovation, incremental development, and aim to increase human development in outer space. So that's kind of a long definition. And the Hangout today is called At the Edge of Growth. I decided to call it that because I have the feeling that in these years, in 2012, 2013, we're at a turning point in this space. We'll discuss this. Not everyone agrees. But I think it represents an interesting time for some analysis. I have the feeling things are going faster now in this year. There's new companies being created. And the existing companies are breaking some milestones. So I've invited three speakers today, and I'll introduce them. I'd like to hear about them, about their personal goals, about their company's goals, and their motivations, why they're investing time and efforts in this endeavor in space exploration, and what are the main drivers. So first, I'll introduce myself a little bit so that you know who we're talking to. I'm called Annelie Schoenmaker. I'm a space lawyer. I used to work for ISU, and I'm still contributing as faculty. I work for ESA, also at the legal department for the telecommunications program. And I'm now at Zero to Infinity, in charge of anything that is not engineering. Zero to Infinity is a high-altitude balloon company. We are already operational to fly payloads up to 1 ton to 35 kilometers, and we're aiming at taking private passengers up to admire the view of the Earth. So next, I'll introduce Arno Wilders. Arno is Dutch. He has a master's in physics, and he used to work for the Leiden Observatory, Dutch Space, and TNO. He performed work for the European Space Agency for several planetary missions. He's currently also a volunteer for the Planetary Society and organizes, together with the Netherlands Association for Spaceflight, many space-related events. So he currently divides his time between Mars One and working at ESA on these planetary missions. So Mars One is a not-for-profit organization whose goal is to establish a human settlement on Mars. But I'll let Arno speak more in detail about this interesting endeavor.
Well, thank you for the introduction and thank you for the invitation. Mars One is indeed a not-for-profit organization, and our main goal is to bring humans on Mars in 2023. And we do this by bringing them on a one-way trip. So it really is part of a settlement, and it's not part of a return trip, so we just go there for 30 days and then we return. The people who go there for the first time, they will not return to Earth. And the main reason for that is that with the current technology, we don't think that there is enough money available to perform that within 10 to 15 years. That was the main reason to do this. And the other thing is that we want to do this because we think it's necessary to create a second world for humanity. It's a very high level goal, I understand that, but we think that that's important to do. And Mars One does this by asking all kinds of companies all over the world which have significant aerospace experience to develop hardware which we think we need to perform this mission, basically. And one of the major questions we always get is, how do you finance this? Because our initial estimate was that a mission like this would cost in the order of $5 to $6 billion. And we did a significant analysis, and we talked with a lot of media experts. One of them is the inventor of Big Brother here in the Netherlands, which is now a major program all over the world. And when we talked to him, he said that this flight to Mars would create so much media attention that in the end you would be able to finance it from that. Of course, this is just a high-level explanation of how we try to do this. The devil is in the details, as usual, but for the time being, we just announced the astronaut selection process, so people are able to present themselves to us, and they can be part of the selection process. And that's going quite well. We have roughly 100,000 people applying right now, and they're in the process of being approved in our quite extensive selection process. And that's going all well. So that's in a nutshell what Mars One tries to do, and also what the current status is.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So our next guest is Max Vozov. So briefly, he's an electrical and aerospace engineer. He used to work at JPL, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, where he spent 6 years contributing to several space missions. Then from 2005 until 2010, he worked for Spacex with many roles, including product manager for the Dragon spacecraft, where he worked on on its certification and human rating. He's now consultant at NewSpace, a private aerospace consultancy. He's also on the board of directors of Golden Spike Company that aims at providing private trips to the moon, as well as involved in a number of other high-tech companies. So welcome, Max, if you'd like to add something.
Thank you for the introduction. Yeah, I guess I've seen NASA from the inside and the outside, and I guess when I left SpaceX, I was very proud of what they had achieved and of my contribution to that. But SpaceX on its own is not enough, I believe. We need a commercial space industry, which means multiple suppliers, multiple customers, competition. And my consultancy is dedicated to bringing the things that I've learned about trying to be commercial in a government-dominated industry to other companies. See if we can get some real successes and make some investors very happy. Because I think that's the key to really having this industry take off and change from what it's been for the last 50 years.
Thank you. And our last speaker, but not least, is Richard David. He's founder of NewSpace Global, which provides market data and access to information related to the commercial space sector. He also publishes a monthly report that details the important events and other business activity in the commercial space sector. So prior to founding NewSpace Global, Richard worked as an investment fund attorney for a large international firm in London and New York. Richard earned his JD at the University of California, Berkeley, where he served as editor for the Berkeley Technology and Law Journal. For the past 10 years, he has traveled the world actively tracking the new space industry. So, welcome, Richard.
Thank you, Annelie. So I'll just try to be brief. I think we have a lot of interesting things to cover on this call, and actually I was just realizing that all three of the other panelists, or I guess the moderator and the other two panelists, have some connection to our analysis. We, in our last issue of our report, we interviewed both Baz Lansdorp of Mars One as well as Nina Aziz. I'm sure Arno knows who that is. Mm-hmm. And also Max has done a lot of interesting work for us, leveraging his work at MV2 and his knowledge of the industry. And in our monthly report, we always try to interview leaders in the industry. So last issue of Thruster, we interviewed George Whitesides and Jeff Grayson, and of course Jose, the CEO of Zero to Infinity, and Annelie. And just to summarize NewSpace Global, the reason why we created the company, it is a New York-based information services provider. The reason why we created the company to track, at this point, over 400 companies worldwide. It's because we saw a critical need to fill this gap between the understanding as brought by the mainstream press, primarily is driven by the mainstream press, understanding of the opportunities as well as the challenges of this next great innovation economy, the commercialization of space, what we're calling NewSpace. And so our analysts, like I said, track over 400 companies worldwide, and regardless of what metric that you pick, number of companies, investors interested, investors putting money in, new customers, new users, new projects like Mars One, whatever metric you pick, we see it all going positively, and that's why I left a much higher paying corporate attorney job to run this company. But for those that are worried, I'm a recovering corporate lawyer, still not practicing them.
Thank you. So let's start with some questions to all of you. So my first question is quite basic, but it's because I want to know why people start to become involved in the new space sector. And you're all entrepreneurs. You've all started your own companies. So what was the drive behind that? How did you start your career, and why did you become involved in the new space sector? Like, especially for Richard, as you said, it's a big change from being an attorney to being an entrepreneur in new space. It's quite a leap.
Oh, you want me to start?
So you can start, for example.
Okay. So my uncle Jack Churn was an Apollo engineer, and that was somewhat meaningless to me at Thanksgiving dinners, sitting next to a guy with a big beard and a pipe and probably a glass of scotch at Thanksgiving, realizing that this guy was helping to put things on the moon. But that was an influence. And I also went to elementary school and high school with Dennis Tito's kids, which was completely meaningless at the time as well, not knowing it then. Obviously, this was in the 1980s, so Tito really didn't have much of an influence on the world as he did in 2001. But those two inputs, as well as I had a physics professor that worked for North American Aviation, who's originally from Hungary in the 1960s, and he was basically laughed out of North American Aviation because he said, I have a business plan to colonize the moon, and we can do it profitably. And this was a predecessor to NASA before the Apollo program, so he was a big influence. And then I was able to watch the first Spaceship One launch. I mean, I tracked the Dennis Tito event with my uncle, which was particularly interesting. And specifically how we responded to Tito's interest to go to space. And then I was able also to watch the first Spaceship One launch in June of 2004, and that to me was like what I would classify as my Kitty Hawk moment. I mean, and what was exciting to me about that, not just the technological achievement, but that how it was funded. In this case, it wasn't NASA money, it wasn't billions of dollars, and it was only 62 miles straight up or so, but it was backed by Paul Allen, private capital, and that to me was particularly interesting. So I as I already mentioned before, the reason why we created NSG, NewSpace Global, but tracking this industry now since about late 90s, early 2000s, I'm particularly excited to be part of it. We are still in the early phase where we are building a nascent industry rather than being able to sort of sit back and just reap all the rewards. And I would like to see more companies out there, especially in the launch vehicle side, to be able to start driving some of these costs down and implementing new innovations with reusability specifically.
Thank you. Arno?
Well, for me, it's quite simple, to be honest. I'm just too young to have seen the Apollo landings. I'm still really recovering from that. And the second thing is that if I'm not doing it right now, if I'm not involved in trying to do it now, then I'm fearing that if I have to depend on ESA and NASA, that I will be dead before we set ever foot on Mars. So there's only one way, and that means that I have to be part of doing it myself. So that was one of the key reasons of starting Mars One together with Bas Lansdorp, and also for the fact that all these comments you always get that a mission to Mars costs more than $150 billion, just like the space station. This is for me really, really not true, and I would call it even bullshit. This is based on the fact that you have to collaborate with too many countries, too many overheads, and if you do it significantly different and you involve a small group of people dedicated to doing it, you can do it for a much lower amount of money. And this is what we basically try to do with Mars One. So, and the other thing is that we see that indeed with companies like SpaceX, launch cost is going to be much lower than it was in the 80s and the 90s. So things will change significantly within the next 10 years. So that's why we started this.
Thank you. Max?
Yeah, I mean, I echo what Richard and Arno have said. I'm myself a recovering engineer who kind of fell into business development and found that the most basic precepts of business that even an engineer can follow are largely foreign to the space industry. And so if you come in with just a degree of common business sense, then you could really revolutionize this industry. The industry is still sort of embryonic because it's been utterly dependent on the government since the beginning. And there's historical reasons for that. It's not anyone's fault, it's just the way it is. But it is clearly never going to grow beyond this nascent stage without a major change of philosophy and attitude and outlook. And I think we are closer to that happening now than we've ever been before, and that's very exciting. And as I said, I think SpaceX is important, but it's not enough. And what really needs to happen is the Space Y and the Space Z and companies at all levels of the industry, from component suppliers to systems and super systems, service suppliers like Mars One and Golden Spike that I'm involved in. These companies need to stand up, apply commercial precepts that are ubiquitous in every other industry, just not in space, and start applying that level of rigor and raising capital, making investors happy, and delivering products and services. And this might sound incredibly obvious to somebody in any other industry, but it's kind of new and revolutionary for the space industry. And so that's what I've given my career over to doing, one company at a time. Some of them I'm involved in founding, some of them I'm just helping as a consultant. But the thing that's really going to turn it around is when some investor makes a 5 or a 10-fold return on investment in 5 years or 7 years, then I think NewSpace Global is going to be ideally positioned to handle the inrush of interested investors. That's already started to happen with SpaceX. It's made commercial space or new space part of the lexicon. But as I say, there's not really going to be a movement until somebody gets rich in space. Right now, there's rich people in space, but they generally got rich somewhere else and brought it to space. Once someone gets rich in space, then I think the industry will turn a corner and hopefully achieve much more in the next 50 years than we did in the last 50 years, because the financing available will be 100 times more.
Yes, exactly. That's why I called it at the edge of growth, but not really there yet. We need somebody to get rich in space, as you say. And exactly, actually, it helps me with my transition to the next question, which is we think of space in the government sense. It's a lot of orbit. But right now, like SpaceX managed to get to orbit commercially, which was a major step forward. As you say, is not enough. And many new companies have since then been created, including Mars One or Golden Spike, which aim for much further than orbit or suborbital. It goes to the moon, we go to Mars. There's at least 3 different companies going to asteroids. So NewSpace seems to cover everything now and not just be suborbital and orbital. So what do you think is the drive behind this? Because I think this is still a question. It was a question for old space, and it's still a question for new space. Why space? So what is the driver? If it's a business, there's money to be made elsewhere, right? Why go into space? Why make it so complicated? So is it just for the business? Is it for the passion? Is it for the applications on Earth, for the actual applications that we can see every day? Or is it the desire, what Arno said a little bit, to find a plan B for humanity, that Earth is not enough? So let's start with Arno, because you started this.
Yeah, well, there are a couple of things. First of all, what I think is happening as well is that people are more and more realizing that Earth is not separate from the solar system. It's an integral part of the solar system. So you cannot see the Earth as a closed system. We see that by looking at different planets, for example, for the greenhouse effect. By looking at Venus, we basically learned on the greenhouse effect theory on Earth, but it goes much further than that. And I think people woke up a little bit with this asteroid or with this small meteor in Russia, where they saw that there are effects coming from outer space which have an influence on Earth. And I think that's one of the key issues that people are starting to take notice of this. And the second thing is that I think this financial crisis is also part of the reasons why people are looking beyond the normal investments and the normal ways of doing business. People are a bit disappointed by the whole financial economical system, and they're looking for different stuff to be involved in and to be inspired by different elements. And I think space, if you talk to small children, every small kid is interested in space. Once they reach a certain age, it's like 13, 14, then the interest seems to be smaller. But in the end, that interest is still there. You just need to tackle it. And I think what we're seeing right now is that there are more and more people, also just ordinary lay people, who are getting interested in being involved in this kind of space activities. So that's a big difference, I think.
Yes, next.
Yeah, I agree. I think everybody is sort of intrinsically interested in space. Maybe not everybody, but a lot of people have a intrinsic fascination with space, and it really takes NASA TV to make them think it's boring. And but really, the thing that's the fact that SpaceX has achieved what they've achieved. I said many times when I was speaking for them at conferences and panels and things that what they're doing is important not because of the rocket or the spacecraft. It's important because they're proving a point that this thing, which only national governments have achieved before, can be done by a startup company, 100 people when I joined, 120 people. And it was very hard to get taken seriously until we got Falcon 1 to orbit, really the second time in a row. That's when you know it wasn't a fluke. And so the technical question has been put aside. Yes, a small commercial company can do this. They can build this rocket. They can build a spacecraft capable of going to the space station and coming back. So that technical question is now put aside. We know that's achievable. You're left with what has been a lot of the discussion in DC and in America. American policy has been the philosophy, the ethics of commercial human spaceflight, particularly human spaceflight. Is it intrinsically more dangerous? I think it's intrinsically more safe, actually. But does the government have the sole right to fly astronauts into space or not? And at some point, that question becomes moot when a commercial company flies their own people into space. And that's really the great thing about businesses like Golden Spike and Mars One, is that they take the discussion completely out of low Earth orbit and start building a business on doing other things beyond that on the assumption that commercial companies are going to be servicing low Earth orbit. So it makes people still arguing about the ethics of flying astronauts on commercial vehicles look like they're on the wrong side of yesterday's war. So I think that is the fundamental shift that has taken place in the last 3 to 5 years, largely due to SpaceX. But as I've said, SpaceX is not enough to prop up the entire industry. And if SpaceX has a bad day, as is likely to happen at some point in this business, you can't have the whole industry collapsing. You've got to have other suppliers of rockets and spacecraft and crew transportation, and you've got to have people depending on those suppliers for their own businesses to transport people to the moon or to Mars or to asteroids, to mine asteroids, whatever it is. You've got to have customers and suppliers and multiple of each. And it's just, there's a glimpse of that now with SpaceX's achievements, and that's never been the case before. So I think that's what's happening now. And it'd be great when investors get rich on this, but to get it going, I think you have to depend to some extent on that passion and vision and excitement that is intrinsic to space. That's really an advantage space has over other industries. It's hard to get that visionary about communications or automotive. But there could be money to be made in space, but it hasn't been yet. But we're on the cusp.
Yeah, thank you. Richard?
So it's a good question. You know, I'm sure Max and Arno did better than I did on standardized tests, but I'm looking for the answer, all of the above. So when you ask, why did, what drove me as an entrepreneur to start NewSpace Global, the business, which I'll translate into financial profitability, the passion, to be part of the next logical step in human evolution, the applications on Earth, which actually is in line with Max's term, down-to-earth technologies, or the desire to find a plan B for humanity. I mean, it's all of those things. But it's not so much a question of, in other words, they're not mutually exclusive, but the question becomes, how do you prioritize them? And then also, critically, who is your audience at that given point in that conversation? So if your audience is somebody applying for Mars One, that's a different message than an audience that wants to finance a company that would compete directly with, let's say, SpaceX as Space Y, as Max would say. So the reason why we created NewSpace Global is to really try to figure out, if you're an investor, so step one, if we're going to fully get the human species off the planet and truly democratize space, if we're going to do that, step one is to, per Max's point, I think, is to actually get returns to investors, because that's the critical piece to move away from government reliance, because it's still expensive. Cost per pound to get just a mere 62 miles, still bloody expensive. And until we get reusability and figure out new propulsion systems, which some of the companies that we track are certainly developing, until we have those capabilities, launch costs are still so expensive. So how do we reduce cost to launch so we can actually democratize space, both in terms of human spaceflight, so instead of 600 people in the history of humans going a mere 62 miles, we have tens of thousands or even thousands going to Leo, Geo, or other planets to the moon. How do we get there? It's reducing the cost to launch, obviously, assuming that those companies would pass the cost reduction down to ticket reductions. But also it's microgravity research. There could be potential breakthroughs in NSG at NewSpace Global. We analyze those companies. But my main point here is that we look at the industry along 8 verticals. So we look at these 8 verticals, and without going through all 8, anyone can go to our site and sign up for a trial account and see or go to newspacewatch.com. You actually don't even have to log in, and you can see our 8 verticals. And on those 8 verticals, we look at what's existing today. I mean, it's very financially driven in terms of revenue and what's potential. And what's existing today, whether we like it or not, it's actually the companies that Max would say probably wouldn't excite his kids. And to Arno's point, kids would probably rather run away and hide than talk to you about remote sensing. But on the other hand, there's a $50 billion first vertical subsector, satellite industries, DirecTV, and SES and Intelsat. And those are the primary customers today, not coincidentally, of SpaceX. But as you move down the verticals, it gets less and less existing. But here's the kicker. As you move further to the right to what we call the cold end, you get into space-based power, what would be critical to maybe living on another planet, and you get into asteroid mining, and you get into lunar exploration, and you get into the things that probably are more interesting to children, and for most of us that haven't repressed that childlike fascination of the cosmos. But in terms of communications to your investors, which I think are critical to get this thing going, you kind of have to talk in their terms. And as we unfortunately all know, most investors are not enlightened enough to think in 10, 20-year spans. To them, in Wall Street, long term is 2 quarters from now, 6 months. That's like a long-term investment. So in that context, we have to be really careful who we're talking to. So, in short, I would say all of those things are drivers for me. And as far as, a plan B for humanity, I mean, Arno mentioned this before. I mean, if you think Stephen Hawking is a smart guy, I happen to think he's fairly intelligent. To put it lightly, he thinks that we need to figure out a plan B in the next century or so, otherwise we could be in trouble. And then all this discussion about ROIs and venture capital and what the markets are, total bullshit. And it's all about how do we survive as a species. But until then, we have to, again, know who we're talking to in order to speak their language and get them to finance these things, even if they are in somewhat, more mundane technologies.
Thank you. And actually, I'm going to add another driver to this that we actually talk about quite a lot at Zero to Infinity is the perspective that we gain on Earth when we are flying in space, and that's what we want to give our customers, basically our private passengers, that will get to see the Earth from space and really have time to look at it and realize that we may need a plan B, but we already have plan A, and we may need to take care of it also. And so that's also a driver, I think, for the space industry. So to come back to the SpaceX trigger, I think it is like what Max was talking about is actually related to my next question. I think this change of pace that we've seen in the last few years is largely due to SpaceX, as you said. So you have the insight. So maybe we can start talking about a little bit how did this happen? How did this become a reality for SpaceX? It was a small company, and it became the first one to ever get a payload into orbit privately. And so I think this is the trigger. So could you tell us a little bit more about what do you think made this possible? And do you think it is the trigger for change?
Well, I mean, there's going to be many books written, I'm sure, about SpaceX and about Elon Musk. Elon as an individual is obviously extraordinarily savvy in both technically and in a business, as a business leader. It's kind of hard to find that. You find a lot of technically good people who think that they're good at business, but there's very few examples where the results bear that out. SpaceX is one of those few examples, as is Tesla and PayPal, I guess. So there's a number of factors that made SpaceX successful to date. His ability to change track in those first couple of years after starting SpaceX, when he went from saying, we're not going to do any of this ourselves, we're just a systems integrator, to actively drawing just about every single aspect and component of the rocket in-house. That was a key decision. It certainly helped that he had the personal capital to back that. That's not an option for most startups. But that allowed cost control in a way that was unprecedented in this industry. So that certainly was a big achievement. And I think just having the tenacity to stick with it after 3 consecutive failures of the Falcon 1, that was a pretty depressing day, that third time it failed in a row. But 8 weeks later, we got it to orbit, and then did it again, and then, of course, Falcon 9, and I'd like to say it's all history, but there's still some big hurdles ahead for SpaceX. So I think that was key. I think the ability that they could do it at all shook the industry, and the ability of them to do it in-house without engaging the Boeings and the Lockheeds and the behemoths of this industry was also very jarring to the industry. And I know that big old space now is grappling with how to adapt. Do they spin out little phantom works like Boeing has done for the CST-100 crew capsule? Very impressive what Boeing has achieved there. The question is, how will it go if they get selected and it gets operational? Will they still be operating it as a Skunk Works, or will they be operating it as Boeing, which puts us right back where we were with the Space Shuttle, for example. So I think SpaceX was a trigger in proving the point that technically it's it's achievable, and that it's achievable at prices that are significantly lower than the industry expected, and using paradigms of development and manufacturing that are very different to the industry expected. Again, a lot of these things are not foreign to other industries like automotive, but they're new to the space industry, and it's forcing them to sit up and take notice and hopefully adapt. Now, I hope that that sticks, and that will depend on SpaceX's ongoing success. And because there's always bad days in this industry, I hope there are others as well that we can depend on to show commercial and technical success. But yeah, I think that was the trigger.
Thank you. And so, Arno, I think Mars One was one of those companies that were triggered.
Of course, but yes, but I don't think we were only triggered by what SpaceX. I think SpaceX was the major contribution. I agree with that. But I think one of the key issues or key turning points I found was when Richard Branson stepped into Virgin Galactic. When he saw that the second flight worked perfectly, he immediately called his lawyers and made sure that he became part of this. And to be honest, I was really surprised that someone from the mainstream investors was willing to take that risk. So that for me gave the idea that there was much more possible than just staying within the government space dominated area. And seeing that people completely outside the space industry were interested in becoming part of this. And
I was curious, but do you, I don't know exactly the date where you launched Mars One and how you approached investors and potential investors, but do you have the feeling it received a better welcome thanks to the NewSpace successes like Virgin Galactic and SpaceX?
Without them, we would have been laughed at immediately. This is clear. Because what we always said with Mars One is that we would use technology which was already existing. We're not designing a warp drive, or we don't need to have nuclear power stations for the Mars settlement. So we always said that the technology which is existing right now, we would use that. We're not relying on anything else. So we had to show investors, but also sponsors, that there are already certain components existing which are being used in spaceflight, which we would rely on.
And so, Richard, since you have a bit of an overview of this industry, since you're tracking all the different companies, what's your analysis of the past year since SpaceX's successful launch? Do you have the feeling this had a repercussion on all the other companies too, or?
Yeah, so that's a good question. You know, I would be lying if I told you that it wasn't. You know, SpaceX wasn't having a tremendous impact. And NewSpace Global has, you know, attained some, it's kind of like what Arno just said, in terms of communicating with potential customers of ours, subscribers that might be in the financial sector, for instance, that don't really know much about what's going on in the industry, that you can leverage SpaceX's very public success as being a fully funded, you know, private money, although with a public sector customer, to get to LEO with a capsule at least capable of bringing apples to the crew on station. However, the critical piece that I want to emphasize here, that I emphasize on a constant basis, is that the mainstream press, they do a great job of talking about SpaceX and talking about Virgin Galactic, and frankly, Mars One at this point is getting a lot of good coverage. But it's NewSpace Global, our analysts track over 420 some odd companies worldwide in the industry. Now, of those 400 plus companies, some of them are very, we would call pure NewSpace companies. So you take an example, something like a Golden Spike, which Max is involved with, or Planetary Resources, or Skybox Imaging. But there are other companies that might just have a small percentage of their overall revenue dedicated to space-related activities, such as Cisco's IRIS program, First Internet Router in Space. But when I look at the success of SpaceX, I can't stop but also look at what Zero to Infinity has been doing with its high-altitude balloons. What new companies emerging and competing in some of the farther-reaching things like Deep Space Industries, Planetary Resources, Golden Spike, and of course the suborbital companies like Swiss Space Systems and Xcore and Virgin Galactic, and this whole coral reef of innovation around the payload side. So companies like Skybox and Cosmogea and Maiden Space, NanoSatisfied, Daria Aerospace, there's just, we're seeing, and this is the main takeaway, is that yes, SpaceX did something great multiple times. And I don't really care, yeah, they haven't sent a human to orbit. They've done remarkable things. And I've actually personally attended the last 3 launches, and every time I love to watch it. But on the other hand, what mainstream press is good at is what NewSpace Global doesn't focus on, and that is just to highlight what the big companies are doing. It's also all the other ones, and try to do it in a comprehensive way. And thank you, Max, for saying that we are in a position to do well as the industry grows, because we do want to be the market leaders in business intelligence to help those investors to be able to make sense of 400 companies and counting. And my prediction is that in a few years we'll probably be up to 1,000 companies. And it's not because of just SpaceX. It's because there are a lot of very smart people out there that see opportunities up and down the supply chain that want to capture some interesting markets and technological breakthroughs.
Yes, exactly. And this also brings me to the last question, which is how do we see the future? I think for a long time, especially mainstream media, of course, was focusing exclusively on space tourism almost. When we were talking about private space, it was very much focused on space tourism, things Virgin Galactic and Spaceship Two. These days, the rage seems to be going more to asteroid mining, exploration, deep space exploration, and also payload to orbit. All the space tourism providers are also trying to get to the payload to orbit market. So, what do you think will win? What will be the real space new space business in the end? Where will the money be made in the end? What is your prediction? Let's start with Max.
Where will the money be made? I guess if I knew that, I would be making a lot more money than I am. I mean, you look at the capabilities that are coming online. It's transportation to and from low Earth orbit, which is the biggest, as it's been said, if you're in low Earth orbit, you're halfway to anywhere in the solar system. So that is clearly coming online from at least one provider, maybe two in the short term for cargo and or crew. Then you look at the businesses that will be formed leveraging that new capability, that emerging capability, and that is things like Golden Spike, to fly commercially people to the moon commercially. That would absolutely not be possible without the technologies that are coming online now and the price points that are coming online now for not just SpaceX, but from others as well. And Mars One, and to a large extent, all of these asteroid mining companies, deep space industries, planetary resources, they're all leveraging the capability that's coming online from SpaceX. Now, you don't know that they're all going to work 10 years from now. They probably won't all work. But if you get a few businesses that are depending on, of course, Bigelow's the other one that we haven't talked about today. He was really 15 years ahead of the curve in anticipating human transportation to and from orbit. Now that it's beginning to happen, they're very well positioned to carry out their business plan from 15 years ago. And if you get businesses depending on this new capability, then you will also get competition for that new capability, which means other people flying people to and from orbit. And that starts to look like a healthy ecosystem in which one company or one product can fail and the industry keeps going. And of course, all the suppliers to all those launch vehicles and to all those space hotels and to the habitats on the moon and to the resupply of Martian bases. I mean, this is the way the industry can develop. And that's why it's at this critical point right now where you have to get that first step, which is the railway to space, the dependable, low-cost, no-frills transportation to and from low Earth orbit, and then you let industry take it from there. And NASA's been a good anchor customer, but it's probably not enough to prop it up in the long term. So 10 years from now, I hope that SpaceX has seen it through. I hope that there are businesses depending on SpaceX, and I hope that there are competitors for SpaceX online.
Thank you. Arno?
Well, I think it's an extremely difficult question, that's first of all. What I think is becoming more and more important is that we see that these developments are going on in the US. I think in Europe we are lacking behind for maybe 8 years. Maybe that's even conservative. Maybe it's more than 8, it's 12 years. But we also see now that there are some new companies coming up, like Swiss Space Systems, for example, and of course Zero to Infinity is trying to bring people up there. So even in Europe, we see now that there's more potential of getting those companies in place and making profits out of it. So what I would expect to happen is that what I'm seeing going to happen is that there will be a new launch vehicle company within Europe within 5 to 6 years coming up, which should start to compete with Arianespace. Arianespace has basically got in Europe the monopoly. They can do whatever they want. They can ask what price they want, and this needs to change. If we want to be in Europe competitive to what's going on in the US, this is one of the key issues which needs to change. And I think there are some potential new companies trying to do that. So what I hope that what will happen in 5 to 6 years is that there will be a key competitor for Arianespace, which makes launching within Europe much more cheaper.
Yes, I think this touches on another question that we won't have time to speak of today. But maybe Richard, you can include it a little bit. It's the geographical component that we focus a lot on the US and on what they do. Arno and me, we're both in Europe, and it's true that it's even harder here to get people to think it's realistic and to invest in it. Although we are succeeding, but we are lagging behind.
Can I add something to that, Annelie? Because I think one of the key reasons for that is that for ESA it's much more difficult to be one of the anchor partners for NewSpace, because we have 18 member states which need to agree on one single thing, and you know as well as I do that this is virtually impossible to achieve. So once ESA becomes more and more convinced that this is something which could happen, and I know internally that there are some movements of people realizing that NewSpace is something which ESA needs to be at least acknowledged and maybe even be part of. So I think there are some changes to be expected within the next couple of years.
And I also think that Europe has actually a strong position thanks to the regulatory environment, which is not yet existing, but we don't have anything as restrictive as ITAR, for example, which I think is a big restriction for many of the new space companies in the US, which will limit their markets a lot to the US territory. And I think, for example, Asia is something that we haven't talked about at all today, but I think they have that's the biggest market, maybe that's where most of the money is made these days. And maybe Richard, you have a better view of what's happening in Asia and what the future would be with Asia there. And
so all I have to do is cover where you make the most money in NewSpace, what's happening in Asia, anything. I can do this in 30 seconds.
Perfect.
I'm teasing you. These are all very good questions. Just as Arno said, it's a tough question, and to steal, I'm very good at stealing Max's jokes. So I'm gonna borrow one from him. What we led with, which is if I actually knew the answer to where you can make the most money, I would be answering this from station, because I would be there right now, having bought a ticket through Space Advantage, because I don't know what else to do with all my money. But on a serious note, I think one aspect, Annelie, that I think we should touch upon before the Asia question, I would love to talk about that, although I'm probably more interested in Arno's vision of 5 to 6 years now, having a potential space Y coming out of the place where rocketry arguably began in Europe. But I would say is small satellites. So again, probably not that one area that are the 5-year-old versions of the four of us would want to talk about. But there is a very interesting thing happening right now where 3 companies in particular, all based in Northern California, which would be Skybox Imaging, NanoSatisfy, and Cosmogia, have all raised collectively over $100 million in the last 24 months or so, 24 to 36 months alone, from very credible venture capital funds. And only one of those companies actually has had a payload in orbit, and it only happened just last month, and that's this Cosmogia, which got over $10 million from Draper Fisher Jurvetson December of last year, and DFJ is a major investor in another company called SpaceX. So what we're seeing in NewSpace Global, our analysts are seeing a significant cultural or economic shift taking place, where when it comes to where can money be made in the short term, it's in the disruption of that $50 billion satellite industry, what we call the first vertical. And the disruption is analogous to the mainframe computers being displaced by personal computers in the 1970s. And when you're dealing with a cost per pound to get to even LEO at the cost that it is today, if you can reduce the size of the payloads, obviously that would, without losing capabilities, and I do know with Earth observation, simple physics, you can't reduce the apertures too much, otherwise they become useless. But with other things, maybe that some of these small sats could be capable of doing, or even with Earth observation, I see a tremendous market there. What I'm concerned about is that some of our future potential leaders of launch vehicle companies will end up just focusing too much on the payloads, and then what ends up happening, I'm talking about even at the student level all over the world, because they say, hey, I can actually build this small payload and even get it potentially to orbit in my my lifetime, as opposed to something that would be far more ambitious and may never happen, and we end up not having that space Y entrepreneur or that space Z entrepreneur, which I think is absolutely critical, and I think everyone on this panel agrees that we have some competition with launch vehicles. I guess I'll end on this one statement before touching briefly on Asia, and that is, we have a saying, NSG, which is if you ignore the first vertical, which would be satellites, then you don't. I'm sorry, let me back up. If you ignore the third vertical, which is human spaceflight, getting humans to space, if you ignore that, you don't have a heart. And if you ignore the first vertical, which would be satellites, you don't have a brain. And I hate to put it so bluntly, but the reason why I'm saying that is you can't ignore $50 billion industry. If you want to convince the financial sector, which is something we do constantly, that you can do, unlike what Elon used to say for years, which is the best way to make $100 million in space, to start out with $1 billion. And now he doesn't say that anymore because SpaceX has done much better than people potentially anticipated, that you go to where the money is today. However, that said, you ask me where do I think the money is, I think probably the vast riches will actually be on the colder end of our 8 verticals. So that's going further out there. That's looking at things that today are non-existent and arguably will be the most financially lucrative, doing things that are far more interesting, manufacturing in space, space colonization. But I just think it's all about what your time frame is. And then with respect to Asia, so one of the companies on our NSG 100 index, Asia Broadcast Satellite, we've interviewed one of their C-level executives for a monthly report, Thruster. It's a cultural thing, which is to say it depends on how you look at it. We're all quite aware of the Chinese capabilities, having sent astronauts into space and building their own space station even. But when NSG, we focus on companies. So we look at our companies competing with one another, and frankly, in terms of companies, there's next to none coming out of Asia. Now, Asia being interested in being consumers or customers of some of these companies that we track, that might be of interest. Will this change? I was down in Brazil the end of last year. It's the same kind of thing. The B in brick, and we're talking about the C in brick more or less. I think this might change. But about 75% or so of the companies that we currently track, of over 400 companies, are based in the U.S. And that's just because the U.S. tends to be, I think, a little bit less risk averse, maybe more interested in trying to find solutions rather than waiting for the public sector to provide all the solutions. Having friends that are European and engineers, they tend to complain about that. The common mentality in Europe is, why should I try to build a better light bulb when the government's just going to do it better than I will? But I have to remind people that the automotive industry in Europe is entrepreneurial as anything in any industry, and the reasons why it's not as entrepreneurial in NewSpace, it stems from World War II, which is the last time the Germans had access to rockets. It didn't bode too well for their enemies. And I think that we're still dealing with that actually today, but if you looked at the engineering prowess and energy that they put into the automotive industry, well, let's just imagine that there were payloads and launch vehicles. I think we'd see the BMW and the Porsche and others of space. Same with Italy, for that matter.
Thank you. I think that's a very interesting vision for the coming years. We have a lot to look forward to. I think we'll have to stop now, because otherwise it's going to be too long. This was very interesting, and I thank you all for joining me tonight. Yes, do you want to have a final word? Otherwise, we'll just say goodbye.
Thanks for organizing it.
Yes, definitely. It was interesting to be part of.
Yeah, thank you, Annelie. I really appreciate it. I've never used Google Hangout with these cool bars underneath. I feel like we're on CNN.
Yes, exactly. We're doing our own mainstream media here.
There you go.
Okay.
Cool.
Thank you very
Thanks,
much.
guys. Good to see you.
Bye-bye. Yeah, good to see you. Yeah.
Take care.
Bye.